There's a stretch of land running from southwestern China down through Laos into Thailand, threading through Myanmar, ending at deep-water ports on the Andaman Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. On a map, it looks ordinary, just terrain, borders. In person, it's something else entirely. Trains are now moving through mountains that took engineers nearly a decade to tunnel through. Ports are expanding faster than the satellite images can keep up with. Industrial zones are appearing in places that 10 years ago were rice fields and jungle. The total investment across the corridor, when you add up the rail, the highways, the power grids, the port expansions, and the special economic zones, sits somewhere north of $62 billion. And most of the world isn't watching. This corridor is quietly doing something that traditional shipping routes can't do. It's giving manufacturing, energy, and trade a way to move across mainland Southeast Asia without ever touching the Strait of Malacca. That single fact is reshaping more than people realize. Look at a map of global shipping. Almost every container leaving East Asia for Europe, the Middle East, or Africa passes through one narrow body of water between Malaysia and Indonesia. The Strait of Malacca is about 500 miles long and at its narrowest point, less than 2 miles wide. Somewhere around a quarter of all global trade moves through it. For decades, this was just geography. A useful choke point, efficient, predictable. Now it's something more complicated. It's a vulnerability. A single incident, a single blockage, a single shift in regional politics, and a significant portion of the world's manufacturing supply chain slows to a crawl. Countries with serious export economies have spent the last 15 years quietly asking the same question. What happens if we don't have to use it? That question is what this corridor is answering. The most visible piece is a railway. It runs from Kunming in southwestern China down through Laos, ending at the Thai border. On paper, that sounds modest. In reality, the line crosses some of the most punishing terrain in Asia: mountains, river valleys, geological zones that engineers genuinely weren't sure could be tunneled through safely. More than half the route runs through tunnels and over bridges. The country it passes through, Laos, is roughly the size of the United Kingdom and had almost no functional railway system before construction began. The project cost somewhere around $6 billion in a country whose entire annual economy is not much larger than that. When the first train started running, the trip that used to take days by truck on winding mountain roads dropped to about 10 hours. Cargo that used to sit in customs queues at multiple checkpoints now moves on a single sealed corridor. That's not a transportation upgrade. That's a different economic geography. Railway gets the headlines. The ports are doing the actual heavy lifting. On the western edge of the corridor, deepwater port projects on the Bay of Bengal are being expanded or rebuilt almost continuously. Kyakbu in Myanmar, Chittagong further west. These are ports that until recently handled regional shipping and not much else. Now they're being built for global capacity. On the eastern edge, the Gulf of Thailand ports and the southern Chinese ports at Beibu Gulf are absorbing the cargo that used to route entirely through Singapore. The cranes are bigger, the container yards are bigger, the rail connections feeding them are new, and the math is starting to favor them. A shipment moving from western China to Europe can, in theory, now travel by rail to a deep-water port on the Andaman Sea, cross the Indian Ocean, and reach European markets without ever entering the Strait of Malacca. The route is shorter on paper. More importantly, it's shorter politically. That's the part that matters. The marketing version of this corridor talks about days saved, faster shipping, reduced fuel costs. Those numbers are real, but they're not the actual reason this is being built. The real value is route redundancy. Modern supply chains are obsessed with single points of failure. The pandemic showed what happens when a single port backs up. The Suez incident showed what happens when a single canal closes. The trade tensions of the last decade showed what happens when a single relationship sours. Companies and countries are now willing to pay enormous premiums for alternatives. Not because the alternatives are faster, because the alternatives exist. This corridor isn't trying to replace the Strait of Malacca. It's trying to make the Strait of Malacca optional. That's a much harder thing to build and a much more valuable thing to own. Wherever the railway touches a city, something predictable happens within about 18 months. Land prices spike, industrial parks get announced. Factories that used to operate in southern China, where labor costs have climbed steadily, start migrating south. Electronics assembly, auto parts, solar panels, textiles. Vientiane, the capital of Laos, is now seeing the kind of construction boom that 20 years ago was happening in coastal China. Northern Thailand is filling up with logistics hubs. Sections of Myanmar that haven't seen serious industrial investment in generations are being studied for special economic zones. The pattern is straightforward. Infrastructure first. Industry follows. Population shifts toward the industry. Cities grow. New corridors of demand appear. This is how economic geography actually changes. Not through policy announcements. Through ports and rails and the slow, irreversible movement of factories toward cheaper logistics. The corridor isn't just for cargo. Oil and gas pipelines now run alongside the rail in significant stretches. A pipeline crossing from the Myanmar coast all the way into Yunnan province allows oil tankers to offload at the Bay of Bengal rather than sailing the additional weeks around Southeast Asia. The energy savings on time alone are enormous. The strategic implications are bigger. A country that imports the majority of its oil through a single narrow strait has one kind of energy security. A country that can also import through a pipeline from a completely different ocean has a different kind. Not better in every way, just less concentrated. The same logic is shaping new electricity grids. Hydropower projects in Laos are exporting power to Thailand. Solar farms in southern China are feeding into networks that cross borders. The corridor is becoming an energy artery as much as a trade one. When most people hear about megaprojects, they think about the final ribbon cutting. The shiny train, the new port, the press release. The real cost is measured differently. Laos took on significant debt to build its portion of the railway. A small economy carrying a project that in scale was almost unprecedented for the country. The repayment terms, the equity arrangements, the long-term concession agreements, these are the parts that shape political relationships for decades. Myanmar's port projects come with their own complicated negotiations around land use, displacement, and revenue sharing. Thailand has navigated multiple rounds of bidding, political shifts, and route revisions before its sections moved forward. These projects don't just connect economies, they entangle them. The infrastructure becomes a long-term relationship, written in concrete and steel, harder to unwind than any treaty. That permanence is part of what makes the corridor so significant. Once it's built, it's built. The economic gravity it creates will keep pulling for 50 years or more. For 30 years, the story of Asian manufacturing was simple. China built it. The world bought it. That story is changing in real time. Wages in coastal Chinese factories have climbed steadily. Younger workers are less interested in assembly line jobs. Energy and land costs are higher. The country is shifting toward more advanced manufacturing and consumer markets, leaving room below for someone else to handle the volume work. Vietnam absorbed some of it. Bangladesh absorbed some of it. India is absorbing some of it. But mainland Southeast Asia, the stretch this corridor runs through, has been the missing piece. Landlocked or poorly connected economies that couldn't easily plug into global shipping. Now they can. The rail connects them to deep water ports in two oceans. The ports connect them to everywhere else. A factory in northern Thailand or southern Laos no longer has the logistics disadvantage it had a decade ago. Cargo can move out cheaply. Components can move in cheaply. That's the kind of shift that doesn't make headlines for a long time. It just shows up 10 years later in trade balances and GDP charts that look completely different than they used to. Look at a satellite image of any major node on this corridor from 10 years ago. Then look at one from this year. The differences are jarring. Ports that were small regional facilities are now stretching for miles along the coastline. Cities that had populations under 1 million are pushing past 2. Highways that didn't exist now running for hundreds of kilometers across terrain that used to be inaccessible. The lights at night, viewed from orbit, tell the story most clearly. Whole regions that were dark a decade ago now glow. Infrastructure does this slowly, and then suddenly. The construction phase takes years and feels invisible. The economic phase, once the rail runs and the ports open, compounds quickly. The corridor is now in the second phase. $62 billion is a meaningful number, but it's small compared to what comes next. The corridor is creating new pressure on global shipping companies, which now have to compete with rail and alternate ocean routes. It's creating new options for manufacturers, which can now diversify production away from single-country dependency. It's creating new revenue streams for the countries along the route, which collect transit fees and port charges and tax revenue from the industries that follow. It's also creating new strategic realities. Trade routes have always been a form of quiet power. The country that controls the route, or even just hosts a critical piece of it, has leverage it didn't have before. This is part of why other regions are watching closely. India is investing heavily in its own corridor projects to the west. Japan and South Korea are financing alternative routes through partnerships with Southeast Asian nations. The European Union has announced its own infrastructure initiatives. The competition for the next generation of trade arteries is genuinely underway. The corridor through mainland Southeast Asia is the most advanced of these efforts. It's not the only one. It won't be the last one. Infrastructure is slow power. The interesting thing about megaprojects is how unromantic they look up close. A port is just cranes and containers and trucks. A railway is just track and tunnels and signal boxes. An industrial park is just warehouses and parking lots and chain-link fences. None of it photographs well. None of it makes for a satisfying news cycle. But these systems decide where economies grow. They decide which cities expand and which ones stagnate. They decide which countries become essential to global supply chains and which ones get bypassed. They decide in slow accumulating ways where the center of economic gravity sits over the next half-century. The corridor running through Laos and Thailand and Myanmar and southern China is one of these decisions being made in real time. $62 billion is just the visible part of it. The actual cost, when you add up the migration patterns, the industrial relocations, the energy infrastructure, the diplomatic arrangements, is far larger. And the actual return, measured in trade flows and regional influence and supply chain resilience, is larger still. The quiet reshaping most viewers will never travel through this corridor. Most will never see the ports or ride the trains or visit the industrial zones springing up along the route. The corridor will affect their lives anyway. The phone in their pocket may be assembled in a factory that exists because of this rail line. The electric vehicle in their driveway may contain components routed through these ports. The price of consumer goods, the resilience of the supply chains feeding their grocery stores, the geopolitical balance of the region their country trades with, all of it is being slowly adjusted by the construction happening right now. This is how infrastructure works. Quietly, patiently, expensively, and then all at once. The corridor isn't finished. Sections are still under construction. Disputes are still being negotiated. Political shifts in any of the countries involved could slow things down or speed them up. But the underlying direction is clear, and at this scale, direction is almost everything. A region that was once a transit afterthought is becoming a transit destination. A choke point that defined global shipping for a century is becoming optional. A map that looked settled is being redrawn, not in lines and borders, but in concrete, steel, and shipping containers. The next decade of global trade is going to look different than the last one. A lot of that difference is being built right now in places most people couldn't find on a map. Watch the ports, watch the rail, watch the industrial zones. The map is changing in real time.